I was the doctor in old tannery town the autumn the smoke came across the ford, and I'll tell you straight, Cale Renwick would have been a dead man by sundown if a woman he had never spoken to hadn't risked her own neck to set that fire on the ridge. He didn't know it then. He thought it was a brush blaze. He thought he was lucky. I knew the truth a week later, and what I learned about Nolly I Sky on Water that winter changed how I see the whole stretch of the Bonewater Range, and how I think about a hard man's heart. My name is Ezekiel Marrow. Folks called me Doc Esk. I'd ridden that valley 14 years by then, set bones, pulled bullets, buried a few I couldn't save. I knew Cale better than most. He owned the long bench above Spirit Cottonwood Ford, 600 head of cattle, a sound house his father built, a porch with 2 rockers and only one of them ever moved. His wife Lenora had died 3 winters past in childbed, the baby with her. He came out of that grief like a man pulled from a frozen river, alive, but cold all the way through. He worked. He paid his hands fair. He didn't laugh. The trouble that fall came out of the South, where a band of border riders had been pushing up through the breaks, robbing trail stations and burning what they couldn't carry. The Army said 3 weeks. The Army was wrong. They were 2 days off when the smoke went up on the ridge above the ford, and Cale, who had been riding fence on the south line alone, where they'd have caught him in the open, saw the smoke and turned for home to fight what he thought was a wildfire. He met me on the road, his face streaked with ash, his rifle across the saddle, and he said, "Doc, I need every man with a bucket." We rode hard for the ridge. There was no fire when we got there, only a black ring of stones, fresh stacked, and a single feather laid flat on a stripped piece of cedar bark inside it. Cale stared at that ring a long minute. He picked up the feather. He put it in his coat. "Somebody warned me," he said. "I don't know who." We rode back together, and that's when the border riders broke the south fence and tried for the herd. 12 men. Cale in his hands held them off from the bunkhouse with the rifles they'd already loaded because of the smoke. By dawn the riders were running, and the Army finally came on at a gallop, 2 days late as I said. Cale walked the line of his cattle in the cold gray light and counted them all alive, and he kept reaching into his coat to touch that feather like a man trying to remember a name. He came to me a week later in the back room of my surgery, and he set the feather on my table. "You doctor for the Diné families out past the alkali," he said. "You know their marks. Tell me whose this is." I looked at it a long time. I had treated a child of the people 3 springs before, a little boy with a fever that broke just in time, and his mother had given me a worked beaded strip in thanks. The threadwork on the cedar bark matched it, same hand. "Nolly I said. "Sky on Water. She speaks English fair. She's a healer in her own right," she translated for me with the boy. Cale was quiet, then he said, "I want to thank her properly." "Then you'll do it her way," I said, "not yours." That was the beginning, though neither of us called it a beginning. It was just a man trying to settle a debt. I rode out with him in the first true cold of November, the cottonwoods along the ford gone yellow and shedding. He brought no gift, on my counsel not yet. He brought his hat in his hand and the patience to wait. The Diné camp lay 6 miles east of his bench, in a fold of the hills where a spring kept open water all winter. We were seen long before we arrived. 3 men of the people met us at the trail and asked our business in their own tongue, then in plain English. "I came to thank a woman," Cale said, "if she'll hear me." They sent a boy ahead. The boy came back. We were led in slow, past the brush shelters and the drying racks, to a fire where an old man with iron-gray braids sat wrapped in a striped blanket. Nolly I stood at his shoulder. She was perhaps 30 tall, with a steady mouth and eyes that took the measure of a stranger without flinching. Her hands were dyed red-brown at the fingertips from the dye-pot work she'd been doing when we walked in. Cale took off his hat. He said, "Ma'am, I believe you saved my life and my herd and the lives of my hands. I'd like to know how, and I'd like to know why, and I'd like to know what I owe." She listened to him through. Then she spoke, and her English was careful and clear. "I was gathering plant roots on the ridge that morning. I saw the riders come up from the breaks. I knew the brand on their lead horse. They had passed our camp 3 nights before and taken 2 of our colts. I knew where they were going by the line they rode. I thought of you. You buried a child with your wife. I knew that too. The smoke was what I had to give. Cale stood very still. He said, "Why think of me?" "Because 3 springs past your hands found my cousin's husband hurt on your range and brought him to your house," she said. "You did not turn him out. You sent for the doctor, you set his arm, you sent him home with food. I do not forget such things. My people do not forget such things." I confess I had not remembered that until she said it. Cale had not mentioned it to me at the time, and he did not look like a man who took credit for it now. He looked like a man who had just learned that his own quiet kindness had reached out across a season and brought him home alive. He bowed his head a moment. He said, "You owe me nothing. Tell me what I owe you." Nali looked at the old man beside her. He nodded once. She said, "We need salt. The road south is cut by the riders. We are watching the winter ahead. If you can spare it, that is what we need." "Salt," Cale said. "And whatever else stands between your camp and the cold." "Salt," she said, "and nothing else yet." He nodded. He looked at her hands, the red-brown of the dye, and he looked at her face, and I watched his eyes catch on her for the first time and stay caught. He'd been hollow for 3 years. Something flickered in him. He didn't know it. I did. We rode home, and he loaded a wagon. He drove it himself in the first snow. I went with him a 3rd time because his Diné was nothing and her English was something, and a man with thanks in his throat sometimes needs a witness so he doesn't lose his nerve. He brought salt, brought flour, brought a roll of good wool he had bought at the post that morning. He set them down at her feet and he said, "If you want it, take it. If you don't, I'll cart it home. I won't be told yes by anybody but you." She took the salt. She took the flour. She put a hand on the wool and lifted it back into the wagon. "This we will trade for," she said. "Bring it again at the next moon, and we will trade you woven goods that will outlast it. Salt is the kindness of a neighbor. Wool is the work of hands. We will not be in debt for our blankets." He almost smiled. I saw the corner of his mouth move. It was the first time in 3 winters. That was how it went. All that long cold season, small honest exchanges, each side carrying its own weight. He brought salt and grain. They sent back woven goods, and dried meat his bunkhouse came to prize, and a tea of cottonwood bark that broke the fever in 2 of his hands when the lung sickness moved through in February. Nali came twice to the ranch herself for that, carrying her medicines in a folded hide. She would not stay the night. She slept in the wagon with one of the women of her camp and rode home at first light. He watched her go each time from the porch with his coffee gone cold in his hand. The first real talk between them happened in March, when the river broke up and a calf went through the rotten ice at the ford. Cale went in after it, and the cold like to killed him. He got the calf out and crawled up the bank and lay there spent. Nali was on the ridge gathering the first green of the season. She came down and built a fire on the bank with the speed of a person who had done it 100 times before, stripped him of his soaked coat, wrapped him in her own dry blanket, and made him drink something bitter from a horn cup. By the time his hands got there with the wagon, he was sitting up and talking. By the time I got there from town, he was almost himself. I sent the hands ahead. I stayed and watched them by the fire, him on a folded saddle, her on her heels feeding the coals, and I heard them talk for the first time as 2 people, not as a debt and its payment. He said, "My wife Lenora used to scold me for going in the river after stock. She said the calf wasn't worth me." Nali said, "Your wife was right and also wrong. The calf is not worth you. But a man who goes in after a thing is the kind of man who would be gone in after if he fell. You teach your own rescue by your habits." He was quiet a long time. He said, "I haven't said her name out loud in 3 years." "Say it as often as you need," Nali said. "She will not mind, neither will the years that come after." He looked at the fire and at her and at the wet edge of the river and back at her again. He said, "Lenora." Then, after a moment, "Lenora," like he was testing whether the word still belonged to a man who could carry it. He nodded once to himself when he found that it did. Nali fed the coals a stick of cottonwood and did not look at him while he tried it. That was, I think, the kindest thing she did for him in a long winter of kindnesses. I rode home that night thinking about that. Spring turned to summer. Cale cut a fair share of his hay early and hauled 3 wagon loads east, not to trade, but to set in the camps Linta for the winter to come. The old man with the iron-gray braids, Naliai's uncle, the council's voice, met him at the trail this time and walked beside the lead wagon all the way in. They spoke through Naliai. The uncle said the Diné would put a man at the south fence of Kale's bench through the spring calving, because that was the season the riders would come back, and a watcher on the ridge was worth 10 men in the bunkhouse. Kale said he wouldn't take it for nothing. The uncle said it was not for nothing. It was for the salt, for the wool, for the hay, for the doctor he had sent for a cousin 3 springs past, for the way Kale had said to Naliai at their first meeting, "I won't be told yes by anybody but you." Some debts, the uncle said, are not paid by counting. They are paid by standing together. So they stood together. The watcher came. The riders did come back in late May, and there was a short, hard fight at the south fence between Kale's hands and 4 men of the people and what was left of the border band. And the riders broke and ran for good that time. And one of Kale's young hands took a bullet through the thigh that I dug out on my surgery table while he gripped the wood and didn't make a sound. Naliai rode in with the wounded watchman of her own people who had a worse hit through the shoulder. I worked on both of them through the night. She worked beside me. Her hands were steady as my own. When the dawn came up gray through the surgery window, she walked outside with me to wash, and I asked her, because I am an old man and I am allowed, "What is he to you?" She did not pretend to misunderstand. "A friend," she said, "and a man I would not lose." "And to him," she looked at the rising light, "he has not said, he will say when he knows." He knew by midsummer. He came to me on a hot July evening with his hat in his hands the same way he had come the first time, only now he sat on my porch and not in the back room, and he said, "Doc, I want to ask her to walk with me. Properly, by her people's way and mine both, if she'll have me." "Then you'll do it her way," I said, "not yours." He smiled at that. He remembered. He went to the uncle first. He went on horseback alone, and he sat by the council fire 2 evenings, and he listened more than he spoke. He drank what they gave him, and he ate what they gave him, and he did not ask a single question the first night, which I am told was noticed and remembered. When he finally said what he had come to say, he said it like this: "I have loved my wife who is buried. I will not stop loving her. I have learned to love a second woman, who is your niece. I do not ask for your daughter. I ask for your blessing for me to ask Naliai myself. If she says no, I will go home and be her friend until I die. If she says yes, I will build a house where she can come and go between her people and mine until the end of our days, and her people will be welcome at my fire as my own people. I do not ask her to leave you. I ask only the right to stand beside her." The uncle thought a long while. Then he said, through Naliai herself, who had been called to translate her own proposal, "You did not promise to make her one of yours. That is good. You will not try. She is one of ours, and she will remain so. You may ask her." He asked her by the cottonwood at the ford where she had pulled him out of the river. He didn't kneel. He took her hand. He said, "Naliai, I owe you my life and my herd and my hands. That isn't why. I love you the way a man loves the woman he wants beside him for the rest of the road. Walk it with me if you want it." She said, "I will, on the terms I keep." "On any terms you keep," he said. They wed twice, once by her people's right at the camp under the cottonwoods, and once by mine at my own porch, because I was the closest thing to a preacher old tannery town had that summer, and I would not have it any other way. Both ceremonies were full. The uncle stood beside Kale at the second one in his striped blanket and a borrowed hat, and he laid his hand on Kale's shoulder when the rings went on. Half the bunkhouse cried. The cook cried hardest. I myself was suspiciously misted, though I will deny it if asked. She kept her terms. She kept a lodge at the camp and a room at the ranch, and she moved between them as her people's healer and his wife both. He learned enough of her language to greet her uncle properly and to scold a calf in 2 tongues, and once at a hand's wedding he tried to sing a song she had taught him and broke down laughing halfway through, and the bunkhouse hooted at him until he got to the end of it. She learned to ride his big roan and to laugh at his old jokes, and the first morning she woke at the ranch, she walked the kitchen barefoot and rearranged every pot until it sat where a working woman could find it without looking. The porch with 2 rockers got both of them moving again in the evenings, and the bench above Spirit Cottonwood Ford became a place where 2 peoples passed easy back and forth. Salt and wool and hay and word and song. And the border riders were a story we told in winter to children who barely believed us. Cale lived another 26 years. Nolly I lived 28. They are buried together at the head of the bench, under a single flat stone, with cedar bark and a feather laid every spring by whichever great-grandchild remembers first. I'm old enough now that I have buried more friends than I care to count, but when I think of the day the smoke went up on the ridge, the day a woman I had never spoken to risked her own neck to save a man she did not yet know, because once, 3 springs before, he had been quietly kind to one of her own. I think the Lord runs the world on small kindnesses come back at full price, and a hard man's heart, given the chance, will warm to the hand that warms it, no matter whose hand it is. That is the truth of it. That is the whole of it. And if you ever ride up the Bonewater Range in autumn and see a thin line of smoke on the ridge above the ford, you tip your hat. Somebody up there is still looking out for somebody down here. That is how it works out west when it works at all.